Hello. Today in less than 5 minutes, K&G International Advisors will give you a summary of last week's most important international financial news, focusing on debunking false narratives and specifically talking about how fossil fuels are bad. Last week, we introduced the first of our false narratives in financial markets, named deglobalization. We explained why we think ideas like this in markets can be so appealing, offering simple explanations for what's going on in an often complex and random world. The risk of false narratives is that they can lead investors astray, allocating capital to what they think is a major trend but what could be, in fact, an overbought trade with significant hidden risk. Parsing out the true from the false narratives is critical for success for the long-term investor. Spotting false narratives can also offer investors unique investment opportunities to bet against them. This week, the false narrative we want to challenge is a controversial one. Fossil fuels, most notably oil, gas, and coal, are increasingly considered ancient history by many participants in financial markets. This idea spreads beyond finance, even to politics and the wider media, where the growing consensus is one in which fossil fuels will play no role in the future global economy. The argument goes something like this. The burning of fossil fuels to generate energy is causing climate change, and as such, the only solution is to accelerate the transition away from these sources of energy. The latest generation of renewables, solar and wind power, are now much cheaper than fossil fuels, while battery storage and energy efficiency together can replace the energy we derive from burning fossil fuels. Thus, given the green alternatives are now cheaper than fossil fuels and readily available, their days are numbered. Oil, gas, and coal are going away as an energy source, and we can expect to see their demise in the next 5 to 10 years. Put more simply, fossil fuels are bad, and we just need to replace them. It's quite simple. This is with no doubt an appealing prospect from the perspective of anyone who cares about solving climate change. It is a story we would love to believe, if only it were true. Solving climate change in less than a decade, and with alternatives sitting on the shelf ready to be rolled out at scale. It sounds great. The draw of the narrative is powerful. So powerful, in fact, that most major market participants have bought into it. Many of the world's largest investment and pension funds have committed to fully, or at least mostly, diversing from the fossil fuel stock and avoiding investing in this sector altogether. Millions more retail investors have become engaged in investing ethically, with oil and gas stocks often top of the list of investments to avoid. This divestment movement, driven by the narrative of fossil fuels being bad, has been powerful enough to starve the fossil fuel industry of investment capital over the last decade, making it increasingly difficult for those companies to raise capital on international market. Also, it has sent a strong signal to the management team of fossil fuel producers that investing in new supply will no longer be rewarded. In fact, it may even be punished by markets. So that is what pretty much every major fossil fuel company has done. They have restricted investment in new supply and instead reinvested cash flow into renewable projects or in returns to shareholders. The idea that fossil fuels are bad and will go away soon is probably the most consequential and potentially pernicious false narrative in markets today. Firstly, energy is good. It facilitates improvements in quality of life. Around 800 million people today have no access to electricity. 2.4 million people generate heat from cooking and hot water burning by biomass, meaning wood, animal dung, and crop waste, on open fires. This alone causes 3 million premature deaths every year in low-income countries from household air pollution. Bringing electricity to those without it, bringing safer forms of energy for cooking. These are not trivial matters, but transformational for half of the world's population. And as things stand, renewable cannot do this. It is no coincidence that the countries where these populations reside are continuing to invest heavily in fossil fuel power generation, bringing electricity and safer sources of energy to lift hundreds of people out of poverty. It requires a vast amount of reliable, low-cost power. Coal, oil, and gas still offer relatively cheap and quick way to bring large amount of energy to large populations reliably. Renewables can be low cost, but only in certain places and at certain times, while power storage is at least a decade away from being a meaningful place to store excess renewable power for use when the sun isn't shining or wind isn't blowing. Whether we are in the West, like it or not, developing countries are going to keep developing, and this means vast amounts of new energy demand coming from billions of new, emerging, middle-class global citizens. Renewables will play a part in this story, but so too will fossil fuels, and so too will technologies like nuclear power. Further, the concept that fossil fuels are bad, it's so oversimplified, is arguably infantile. The fossil fuel industry powered the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, the single biggest leap in human living standards in the history of our species. Those who think that was bad are welcome to prove it and try living without electricity, modern healthcare, etc. The end result of this powerful false narrative is the energy shortages we are currently experiencing globally today. Years of underinvestment by fossil fuels producers in supply, in response to their demonization in modern culture and divestment by ESG-minded investors, means that there is very little new supply available to meet global demand. Meanwhile, renewables, with all the will in the world, are nowhere near being in a position to make up for the slack and replace fossil fuels in a significant way. We'll have to wait another decade, at least, for that to happen. The truth is, a transition for this scale away from fossil fuels was always going to take a long time, and we need fossil fuel companies to come along on the journey with society, maintaining supplies of the fossil fuels we still need as a steadily shift to alternatives. Sadly, this is a more pragmatic approach, and it's unpopular. It doesn't fit the good versus bad narrative, and so we appear to be continuing down the same road, which will likely to only lead to even worse energy shortages than we face today. There are two very important takeaways here for the investors. Firstly, be careful with investment products labeled as green or ethical. These can often be invested in overcrowded investments, which could fall dramatically in the false narratives of the imminent adoption of new energy technologies if not released. Secondly, fossil fuel companies are not necessarily the boogeyman, and the general dislike of them by investors and modern culture could actually offer a once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest in assets which will be producing strong cash flows for a couple more decades at least. Taking a contrary view here could be rewarding. The sources used on today's video were Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, MarketWatch, and Dominion. My name is Juliana Lato from K&G International Advisors, and we wish you an excellent start of the week. Also, we would like to thank you for watching our video. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all the important financial news, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any queries or further comments.